Yom Kippur is an opportunity for us to remember so much which has happened in our past, the good and the not so good. We remember those who've gone before us, who sacrificed their lives so we can be here today. And so as the custom of our congregation at the martyrology service, we invite a survivor or a second-generation survivor to address our congregation about the Shoah, about those we lost, too many, and not so long ago. It's my honor now to call upon Frida Wilson.
We come together this Yom Kippur to honor the 6 million Jews that perished in the Holocaust and to share the courageous stories of the survivors. Remembering victims and memorializing the survivors' stories is part of our responsibility to never forget. I am honored and touched to be asked to share Abraham Moskowitz of blessed memory, his Holocaust journey. My father Abraham's story was captured very eloquently when he arrived in Mexico City after his liberation and traveling for 4 years. Unbeknown to my sisters and me, we never knew this document existed. I happened to come across it while cleaning some old files my mother kept of my dad. The document, written in Spanish and currently not in very good condition, was a found gift to us. My dad never liked to talk about the Holocaust with my sisters and I when we were young. He really began to tell the story to his grandchildren and to the community of Brownsville, Texas, where we lived. I ask you to hear the words of my father and imagine walking in his shoes through his horrific journey to his eventual freedom. I will now share with you the verbatim translation of Abraham Moskowitz's journey that began in 1925. My name is Abraham Moskowitz Wiseman. I was born in Kielce, Poland on May 4th, 1925. My parents were from the same city. The names were Leon Moskowitz and Helen Wiseman Moskowitz. My brother's name was Herschel Moskowitz. When I was still a young child, my family decided to move to a different city, the city of Lodz. Maybe because my father had 2 brothers that lived there. After some time, my family settled down in Lodz, and I was old enough to go to school and study. Up until I was 12, I went to a normal public school. Then, in 1938, I moved to a professional school for preparatory studies, where you would study in the morning, and in the afternoon, there would be a theory and practice. My hopes for studying for a career lasted until September of 1939, when World War II exploded. On that date, 8 days after the German troops entered the city, I, as a young man, had no idea of the prevailing situation. It did not take long for the first German order that all Jews should wear a yellow star on their clothes. This order came with sanctions. Those who did not wear the yellow star in public would be sent to forced labor camps. Well, I got the short end of the stick, and it did not take long for them to grab me on the street and send me to a forced labor camp. That labor entailed loading and unloading military equipment. Luckily, I look Aryan, and I took advantage of the situation. After 3 months, I was able to escape and go back home. This was a risky life and death decision, but maybe due to my youth, I did not fully understand this. Some time went by, and when one night at the beginning of 1940, SS soldiers came by and gave an order to my family to get out of our house and not to bring any belongings along with us. My parents, sibling, and I were pulled out of the house with just what we had on. Once on the street, we saw many Jews formed in lines. after gathering a great number, they took us to a train station. Like animals, they loaded us up onto open cars and locked us. We were taken to a small town called Noworamsko. When we arrived, everyone was brought to a church. After a few days, my parents decided to use their scarce resources and move to the city of Kels, since they were both from that city, and it was a very risky move because we needed to pass as Aryans. Otherwise, if they found out we were Jewish, they would kill us all. We were very lucky, and we were able to reach the city of Kels as we stayed with some relatives. About 4 months after our arrival, the Germans created the ghetto and locked all Jews inside the ghetto. At the beginning, life in the ghetto was bearable. Food was rationed, and 4 or 5 families had to live together in a small room. Germans started coming into the ghetto in big construction trucks, grabbing people for forced labor. One of those days, my father and I were walking down the street, and they grabbed us for forced labor. They sent us both to work at a military gas station located in an area close to the train station. For a young man my age, it was impossible to bear such hard work. I had to unload train tracks, train cars full of gas and oil. For food, I would get a liter of soup and 1 slice of bread a day. There were other young men like me who were unable to do the heavy work. They would beat us with clubs and sometimes even with metal rods. Many of them died because their health was very poor. My legs were debilitated, but I always had the good luck of being able to overcome this. After a year of this terrible suffering, I was taken back to the ghetto along with a group. I thought we were taken back to the ghetto to switch groups because we were so exhausted, but the reality was different. The ghetto was already surrounded by a great many Gestapo and SS soldiers, and we heard that they were going to eliminate the ghetto. Every day, there were transports going to an unknown destination. My father and I left on the last transport from the ghetto. Before reaching the edge of the ghetto, outside the train station, we had to form up in rows of 3. One senior Gestapo officer was giving instructions and making selections. He would send some to the left and others to the right. I was told to move to the left, and that precise moment, I lost my parents and my sibling. I saw them walk away towards the station. Those chosen to go to the left stayed, and the ones ordered right were walking towards the station to be transported to Treblinka to be burned. I was one of the chosen, and I stayed to clean up the ghetto and the belongings of the Jews that had just left. This was a horrible and macabre task, having to sort the belongings that were left behind, going from home to home and taking memories from people who used to live there. There is an end to everything, and as change was announced, this job was also going to change. One day in August of 1941, I was loaded onto a heavy truck. They took me and other young men to an ammunition factory in the same city of Kels. The factory's name was called Hazag, and there was a new era of suffering awaiting. Work at the factory was exhausting and unbearable. A young boy like me had to learn how to control 3 huge automatic machines. My precise job was to tend to these machines without any previous preparation or knowledge about them. Those machines made casings for grenades, bullet casings, mortar casings, and machine guns. I worked 14 to 16-hour days 1 week, and I would work the next day during the night. I did not get enough food, and the food I did get consisted of 2 slices of bread, one in the morning and one in the evening, and a liter of soup at midday. It was really not soup. It looked more like dirty water. Every day I left weaker and more depressed. On top of all of this, the supervisors would hit me with metal pipes. These sinister methods were used so that I would rapidly learn to control these enormous machines. This was forced labor, and I lived under subhuman conditions. My ideal life was cut short along with my freedom. I slept in a barrack hut where filth and disease prevailed. The treatment was received was not fit for animals. Many times I got sick, and I did not even know what I had because there was no medical assistance. I had to recover at any price. Many times I worked while I was sick so they would not suspect anything. I lived in fear because those who could not work anymore were taken away to be killed. Nevertheless, this time there was a change in my favor. One morning, at the end of August of 1942, after spending about 1 year in hell, there was a change to my suffering. On that morning, many senior Gestapo officers and many officers arrived. Then we all had to come out into the square where we were accounted for every day. The Gestapo chief had a list and started reading names. He said, "The people that I read out of this list stay in line. The rest go to work." My name was on the list, and we were a total of 45 young men. At that moment, what went through my mind was that the other young man was that maybe this was our last hour. They were going to finish us off, but the result was unexpected. When the rest had gone back to work, the Gestapo senior commander gave a speech to the remaining 45 and said that we were the chosen ones, the good workers. They were taking us to his homeland of Germany, where we would be treated well and we would be fed. On that day, we did not go to work. We stayed at the camp, then we were taken for a shower and a haircut, and that evening we received a double ration of bread. Early on the next day, they took us to the train station. They loaded us up on open trains like cattle and locked us in there. Several SS soldiers were there to watch us. After traveling for over 1 week without being able to leave the car, we arrived at our destination, Buchenwald. An incredible panorama appeared before my eyes. A concentration camp so big and with so many men. When we got off the train, they had us form a line in pairs so they could count on us. They had us march to a large building that housed storage and bathrooms. They took away all of our personal belongings that I had with me still. Many papers like birth certificate, approved class certificates, pictures of my parents, my brother, and relatives. I had to take off all my clothes and go into the bathroom. I walked out a different door where they gave me striped pants and a shirt and wooden clogs. They gave me 2 pieces of cloth with a number and a red triangle with a number, and I was ordered to attach them to the top of the pants. The triangle was to be attached as well. They told me that from that moment on, I was no longer a man. I was just a number, and that I had to memorize it because I would be called by that number. My number was 84978. After making us line up again in pairs, they took the other guys and me to the quarantine camp. This means that there were 2 camps inside of one, separated by barbed wire. They called the quarantine camp and the big camp. I spent 4 weeks in the quarantine camp, and then the order came to move me and the group I belonged to into the big camp. I don't even want to remember what I went through, what happened inside the quarantine camp during those 4 weeks. It was pretty well known by everyone. I was housed in barrack number 163 of the big camp. That is exactly where I received news that we were going to work outside. That was exactly right. The group that traveled with me and I were sent to Ostrokommando, a slave labor camp. There we were to build an airplane factory. Since we were specialized workers, they really took good care of us. They housed us in a very large and abandoned textile factory. It was hard at the beginning because there was nothing in it. We had to set up where to sleep, and we had to build a kitchen, and we had to lay barbed wire around the perimeter of the land where the factory was built. The factory was built on a large piece of land, and we started building the very large barracks and very large rooms that would house machines. At the beginning, we started building wings for fighter airplanes. The factory was growing fast, and soon we received a large transport of prisoners to help out. The factory was large and was built, and it was building many planes per month. My job was that of a mechanic, specializing in assembling engine parts. I worked 14 to 16-hour days one week and worked nights the next. I would work for days and days. Many times I was injured by accidents at work. Once I was gravely ill. I had 2 cuts on my left hand. Since the cuts were made by dirty aluminum, my blood was being infected. They gave me an 8-day leave at the camp's infirmary, but I did not want to accept it for fear they would eliminate me. My injuries got worse because the camp's infirmary did not have enough medicine until the supervisors of the factory took me to the germ doctors. It was obvious that they had no cure for me because I was indispensable to do the specialized work. All those years I was sick, weak, and hungry, but just one thing, faith and hope to survive the hell. It was a day during the month of March of 1945 when the American planes came, bombed the whole territory, and destroyed everything. Where there was once a factory, it ended up as rubble. They grabbed us all who had survived and made us march back to Buchenwald. Everything was destroyed, even the train they wanted us to take. Many did not make it. As weak, as devastated as I was, I marched the day and marched at night. Sometimes they would let us rest for a few hours, but I did not lose hope of surviving. On the road, I would see the war was coming to an end, and that would give me strength. After many days, we reached Buchenwald camp. Once inside the camp, they took us to the barrack hut to rest. The camp was in very bad shape. There were many sick. They no longer looked like humans, but walking skeletons. We would take hope, saying, this is not going to last much longer. The war is about to end. The situation was very bad. The last days, we were not getting any food or water. Disease was everywhere, typhoid, dysentery, and many other diseases. The scene at the camp was something hard to believe. The day that I and all the prisoners of the camp dreamed of came. That was April 11th, 1945. The Americans came in, many ambulances, doctors, nurses. They brought trucks of water and food. They gave us first aid, medicines, and many other items. I was a living skeleton. I weighed 30 kilos when they took me to the barrack hut for the sick. Many were not able to survive and died after liberation. Shortly after that, the International Red Cross arrived, and many were transported to Switzerland. After receiving my identity card at the Buchenwald camp, others and I were taken to a place called Schloss Langenthal, There I remained for medical treatment and recovery. After some weeks, I had somewhat recovered, but still under American treatment. Then I was taken to the city of Stuttgart. In the city of Stuttgart, a center for refugees and ex-prisoners was beginning to form. It was natural for people to try to find relatives and find out where they were. After some time, I heard there was another ex-prisoner center forming in the city of Backnang. It was close to Stuttgart, and I decided to go there. But unfortunately, I did not find anyone I knew. Who knew if the people I lived with were still alive, and who knows what part of the world they went to? I really liked the city of Backnang, and I decided to stay there until February of 1948. If I wanted to describe all the things that I experienced and all the things that I went through, we could fill a large book. What I am describing here today are only the most important details. I also want to say that my memory has been failing me late, and many of the memories of what happened blend together. In my biographical description, I mentioned that all of my personal belongings had been taken away from me. That is the reason that I do not have any documents from before the war. I do have documents from after the liberation. After being liberated in April of 1945, traveling the world in search of family and a place to relocate, through many organizations that were helping misplaced survivors, my father Abraham finally heard that he had an aunt in Mexico City. He traveled from Europe to Curacao, where a strong Jewish community existed. The community helped him to get to Cuba to be closer to Mexico. Finally, in 1949, he made contact with his aunt, who was his mother's sister. She had left Poland before the war and settled in Mexico City. His aunt arranged for him to marry a Mexican citizen, a Mexican citizen in order to be able to enter into Mexico. Once he reached Mexico City and was granted citizenship, the marriage was annulled. He met my mother, Esther Eichner, and in 1954, they were married and raised a family of 3 girls. In 1965, my parents received their U.S. immigration papers and moved to Brownsville, Texas, to start a new life again and an electronic import business. My parents lived in Brownsville until my father's death in 2015. In closing, it is our moral, imperative duty to remember what happened and to talk about it. My father's story, along with all of the Holocaust survivors, reminds us that despite profound challenges, the strength of our humanity endures. I hope that each of you and the next generations will join in the efforts to combat hate, discrimination, and ignorance to make our world a better place. Shana Tova.